People risk, your key man risk, right? What if that one person that knows how your entire organization is held together, what if something happens to them, they leave, and that institutional knowledge goes with them? You got to manage that people risk. You've got, technology risk. What happens if there's malware or something that happens that brings down your technology stack? Information security risk, right? This is the information leakage. You've heard so many stories about somebody went dumpster diving and found all of the credit card receipts for all of the customers that had bought something from that company. Privacy. Now you have GDPR and CCPA. All of these regulations are intended to control how you use personal information from consumers. Compliance risk. I mean, I'm in food. The FDA compliance is a huge part of what food businesses do. A legal risk, regulatory risk. I mean, there's just so many aspects to risk. That's why I have a little dad joke at the bottom. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's exhausting. There are so many things that you need to think about when you talk about risk management. Let's talk about risk management in banking, right? The inception of operational risk, I was there for it in the late 90s into the early 2000s. We were still under Basel I, which is the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision's Accord, part of the G10 that came together and said, we really need to have a response, a way to sort of structure the banking system so that it's resilient. Obviously, the banking system is crucial to the smooth running of markets, right? We have settlement risk across these large banks. That's literally what happened during the Herstatt crisis, is that you had a bank that couldn't settle, and it basically grenaded the entire international banking system. So they said, this should never happen. We need to have some standards to ensure that there is resilience within the banking system. So we've gone from Basel I, when I started, to Basel II implementation in 2004. I remember this was like such a big deal. Basel III in 2011. And then we've got a couple of addendums to Basel III, that's now sort of referred to as Basel IV, although it's not formally Basel IV. And that's banking, right? So when you talk about other general businesses, they also have frameworks. So you generally have frameworks that teach people how to apply these risk management principles. How do you bifurcate, categorize risk, and how do you then put controls in place? That's COSOS. The Code of Federal Regulations has risk management standards in there. NIST, this is dealing with information security. ISO 31000, which is also general risk management principles. And then there are industry-specific frameworks. Basel is one of them for banking, but the FDA has a lot of risk management principles that are built into the regulation there. The FAA obviously has a lot of risk management regulations built in there. So industry-specific frameworks are there as well. It is exhausting. When you think about risk management, it is such a big, it's too small word to describe a broad ocean of things, anything that can go wrong. Now, let's talk about innovation. Let's go from the dark side to the light side here. We talk about innovation as something that is using novel methods to achieve the same outcomes, or designing and executing a novel outcome. Now, this is really interesting. Innovation has got a bad rap, because I think in general, people have used innovation as sort of a catchphrase. But in reality, it's learning how to do things in a new way, or coming up with something completely, blue sky thinking, something that's completely, we used to call it the blue ocean, right? Like it's a completely new concept, a new methodology that brings about a new outcome. It does require an increased threshold for risk. So if you think about innovation, it can't happen in where there is a very risk-averse sort of methodology, because what happens when you're risk-averse is you're not willing to take the risk that's required to produce innovation. The other thing that that's interesting is innovation also requires a framework, because you're talking about experimentation, talking about evaluation and feedback. These things don't happen by chance. They're designed. It requires intentionality. Innovation is not something like a weed that just pops up. It's not an idea that you have. Everybody's got an idea. Friends, let me tell you, now that I've started a business, I will tell you that the key thing is execution. Ideas are a dime a dozen, but the people that can execute that vision, execute that idea, that's what true innovation really is. I call this a recipe for innovation. This is just one of the recipes. This is my experience. You need to have risk tolerance because you're going to be experimenting. You need to have resources, both people resources, the appropriate, if you're talking about technology construct, you need to have technology resources, right? So you need the right resources within the organization to be able to execute that innovation. You need a nimble organizational structure. And this is really interesting. So we have IBM back in the 80s, I believe, and Lou Gerstner came in, and they, it was expected that IBM would be broken apart. But instead, he was able to bring a strategy, bring an organization together that then was able to respond to market forces. You really need a nimble organizational structure. When you have a very monolithic organization that is very hierarchical, it's very hard to do innovation well. So you need a nimble organizational structure. You need timing and market readiness. This is really interesting. If you look at Apple Lisa, which was a pad, electronic pad that you could make notes on, it was way ahead of its time and failed completely. The Apple iPad, on the other hand, when it came out, was a roaring success. The difference between these two efforts by the same company was timing and market readiness. The iPhone had primed the market to understand how to interact with an electronic device and what sort of things that people could do with an electronic device, so that the iPad then was a roaring success. But back when the Apple Lisa came out, it wasn't so common. So you have to make sure that you have the market readiness for the solution that you're bringing to market. You need a robust evaluation and feedback loop. And I'm watching the time because, in a little bit, I want to open this up for some questions as well. What I mean by that is, look, if you do an experiment and you don't learn anything from it, was there any value to doing that experiment? No, I think most of us would say no. So what do you need in place? If you're doing an experiment, you need a way to learn from that experiment and then feedback to the next iteration of that product or idea. And that requires a framework to be put in place, right? We don't always say it needs to be this huge monolithic thing, but you need some framework, some rules, so that you're able to then iterate and bring innovation to the market. And then I say innovation and risk management are connected, right? Experimentation, the concept of doing an experiment, is a form of de-risking. Minimum viable product, MVP, is simply a low-cost way to de-risk innovation. Let's talk about some examples here. One example is Google Glass. And it's really interesting because a lot of people on the internet talk about Google Glass as a failure. So Google went out there, created the Google Glass, and marketed it to a niche audience. I consider it to be a roaring success. Why? Because it was an experiment that Google did, right? Google had this idea for Google Glass, and they believed that it was ready for mass market acceptance. They put a product out there, but remember that they put it at a high price point that was not mass market ready, and they marketed it to a niche audience. They basically paid people to test their product, right? I think that was a successful experiment because what they learned from that was the market wasn't ready for that kind of innovation. The technology wasn't ready for that, mass market adoption. I call that a good experiment. They got paid, they got paid for people to test their product. And the contrast, I say, is Juicero. If you Juicero, if you look into this company, right? This was I forget, it was like 5 to 10 years ago, something like that, in that range that it came out. I remember this company. They promised to do cold pressed juices from this machine. Everyone was excited for this. Everyone bought into the vision that they had. But ultimately, when the machine was delivered to the first set of customers, they realized that the cold pressed juice was already in the package. You didn't need a machine. You could literally squeeze the product out of the package. So what was the point of the entire machine, this expensive machine that you had? If they had done some of this MVPs, they would have realized quickly that people had no appetite for a machine that literally just squeezed the juice out of a tube that they could do themselves. So what is experimentation? It's a way to de-risk the innovation process. Both risk management and innovation requires robust frameworks, leadership buy-in, and a seat at the top table to be able to impact outcomes. Let me explain quickly what I mean by management buy-in and a seat at the top table. In my career, I've seen so many ideas of risk management. We have to have a certain system rolled out so that the end line, frontline staff would be able to use that and input certain data in. If we were not supported by management, if they didn't buy into the vision of what we were doing and the value that we were delivering, what we often found was that their staff would not use that system in the way that's intended, and then ultimately would come back to the system doesn't work. It's not that the system doesn't work, it's that management never really believed in that concept. And that goes downhill, right? That flows downstream, and your frontline staff will never be able to really adopt that and work it as it's intended to. So it never gives the benefits that it's designed to do. Seat at the top table is very important as well. If risk management is not at the table with the heads of businesses, we can never be able to deliver our viewpoint, our vision, because we never are able to feed that to people that have the ability to make that impact. We'll go into the corporate version of innovation, but I want to take a quick pause here. I talked a lot. Apologies, but I would love to hear if anyone has any questions so far. If not, we'll continue down this road.
So go ahead and unmute yourself and ask any questions.
Absolutely fine if there are no questions. We can continue.
All right. Actually, just that I think they're still they're mute. Can you guys hear us? You can unmute yourself.
Go ahead, Sarah. I see you raise your hand.
Yes, I just have a question. So,
Sure.
Going back to risk management, I would like to know how Silicon Valley Bank manage the risk management. I'm not a bit curious about that. So if you can give me some answers, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. You're talking about Silicon Valley Bank and the implosion that happened there. So there's been a lot of, we'll do this. It's really interesting, actually. There's been a lot of postmortems that were done on Silicon Valley Bank. And one of the things that came out was that, so the fundamental problem that happened is that Silicon Valley Bank took a bunch of the customer deposits that came in and bought, long-term bonds, for example, right? And the intent was these are very stable. They generally don't tend to fluctuate in value. And then ultimately, the intent was they would be able to pay their obligations. What actually happened is something that they weren't expecting. The interest rates started rising. And because they were rising very quickly, the value of those bonds. Now, when you buy bonds, they're denominated at a certain interest rate, right? So you got 1% interest rate at that time, for example. Well, as the interest rate goes up, you can buy current bonds that are paying 5%. The value of that bond that was at 1% has gone down. And when you look at the overall value, when you're talking about millions of dollars, I think this was several hundred millions of dollars. What then happens is the value of that security has gone down. So when you're using those kind of securities as risk capital, so these are things that, for example, if customers come back and ask the bank tomorrow, hey, give me all the money. I wish I could pull up a little bit of a slide that I did on this, where you have a mismatch in time, time horizon. So you've got deposits that are due on demand. You have bonds that are locked in for X number of years, right? The problem is when customers ask for demand their money back, the bank cannot immediately liquidate loans, liquidate those kind of illiquid assets and give them their money back. So the value of the mismatch in value right now, their assets are going down in value, and their liabilities, the deposits that they have to pay back are on demand. So essentially, the bank there was a bank run, and the bank fell apart. They couldn't pay their liabilities. People came in, swooped, and saved them off. The real question that we have as risk managers is, how could that happen? That is the literal definition of what your asset and liability management committee is supposed to do. Your ALCO committee's job is to make sure that you're managing your assets and your liabilities to ensure that if there's a run on the bank, you still have sufficient capital to pay that back. What happened in this case, the postmortem shows us, is that the managers, the ALM managers, had told management, we cannot make a reasonable assumption that interest rates will not rise in X number of months. Management overrode those assumptions and put into the model and changed the model to show that the interest rates wouldn't rise. What happened? Interest rates rose. They just couldn't pay they couldn't match their liabilities, and then the bank fell apart. So that goes back to, if you do not have management buy-in for your risk management controls, you are ultimately going to fail, because management will override those risk controls and take greater risk with the organizational resources than they should. And then ultimately the organization will fail. I know it was a little bit all over the place. Did that kind of answer the question?
Yes. Thank you so much.
No problem. No problem. I saw someone else had raised their hand.
I think Riley. Riley, you had a question?
Oh.
I thought Riley had a
hand raised. Okay.
Yeah.
No issues. We can come back to that, Riley, if that's okay.
All right.
Okay. All right. Let's continue down this path for a little bit longer. And Riley, when you do come back on. Oh, there we go. Yes, we can't hear you, Riley. So if you want to try to join back in and then ask your question in the next round, if that's okay. All right. So in the meantime, let's talk about innovation within large corporates, because a lot of you are going to probably end up working for large corporates, right? Innovation in large corporates is hard, but it's not impossible. In my last job in compliance, we actually had a huge rollout of an innovation program, which was interesting because you're asking risk-averse compliance managers to take risks. You know, it's a little bit of a tough ask, and it didn't succeed as well as leadership had hoped. And part of the reason is there was this mismatch in people's expectations. When you do innovation, you have to do experimentation, which means you're going to have a lot of failures. Now, when you have someone who's risk averse and you have a failure, you think it's the end of the world. What you need to do is build up a culture that encourages failure. Like, okay, it's all right to fail. There's no problems here. We just need to find a way to make this a success. So you need to iterate and find better solutions. So it's not impossible, but for a large corporate, remember that people within that corporate are risk averse. It's very hard for them to actually get the mindset that takes to do true innovation. Resources and size are what they have on their side, though. For example, HSBC has massive resources. It has got a huge size. It's very hard to run out of resources with a large organization like that. So that is what they have versus the startups. There are typically three ways to innovate in a corporate, right? You build in-house, you buy, which is acquisitions, and you partner, and you build together with your vendors or with other folks in the industry. And corporates often leverage corporate venture capital. I'm sure you guys have heard CVCs kind of floating around. Mondelez has its own Snack Futures is a venture capital. Goldman has their own venture capital. HSBC's was called Strategic Innovation Investments. Many of our large banks have corporate venture capital. And what's the point of a corporate venture capital? Well, they look at companies that are strategically aligned to the corporate, right? These are companies that might already be vendors or have some technology or infrastructure that the company is not able to quickly build. And then they either acquire, they participate, which is they make an investment into, or they learn from, euphemistically saying, learn from these startups. And the idea being that if they participate with the startup, they start to make an investment into the startup. Well, what do they get back in return? If you're an investor and you have a seat at the board, for example, of a startup, you're able to influence how the direction, right? The direction of travel for that startup. If you are a an investor and also the prime customer for that startup, you're able to have a clear say in the direction of the development. So it makes a big impact to have a CVC and to invest and to partner alongside some of those key suppliers. And there are times where, you have an acquihire, which is really they're making an acquisition, but they're making that acquisition for the underlying talent within that organization. So there's been, CVCs are very core to how, in this day and age, corporates are addressing innovation, but it can go wrong. It can go wrong really badly. If, some of the big ones are Time Warner, AOL, and Microsoft's acquisition of Nokia, which they then spun off, and Time Warner also spun off some aspects of the AOL acquisition. So if you look at this, sometimes those acquisitions go terribly wrong. A good acquisition is one where there's value added to both parties and ultimately it grows. Oh, there we go. All right. And then I go back to, it requires risk tolerance, right? Sorry, let me go back. It requires leadership buy-in. It requires a certain of nimbleness. Margin is very important. So, for example, when a corporate is facing a hostile environment, right? So they are in a highly competitive environment, and they are fighting for their lives. That's not the time where they would want to invest into innovation. That's often a time where they will pull closer together, tighter. They're going to shed resources. They're going to reduce their spend. And innovation is a huge spend. Innovation is a huge ask. So the corporate needs enough margin to be able to do that. The last one is the protection from corporate bureaucracy. I heard Steve Blank one time in one of his talks talk about Airbnb, and he said, there's a reason why none of the hotel chains did something like Airbnb. The first thing that would happen is they would go to corporate counsel, and corporate counsel would say, how many lawsuits do you want? Because this is just not going to happen in a way that is compliant at all. So sometimes if you really want innovation, you got to protect it from corporate bureaucracy until the internal teams can work out the kinks and figure out how to do this in a compliant way. Then you need to establish a culture. And that is one of the hardest things in corporates to do, is to change culture. But that's absolutely necessary, because you have to build a culture that encourages risk-taking, experimentation, and you got to celebrate failure, which seems kind of crazy to do for a corporate. But some examples of this, I don't know if you guys have ever heard about Google's 20% rule. It's actually what resulted in Gmail. Paul Buchheit built Gmail in his 20% time. The idea that Google did was they basically said, for all engineering staff, 20% of your time, that is 1 day out of the week, you are free to work on any project that is going to add value to Google, right? So you can go ahead and do whatever you want. And ultimately that ended with Paul Buchheit building what then became Gmail. And you guys know that is a cornerstone of Google as of today. So that's a good way to encourage people to experiment. And it's okay if you fail, but it's great to just keep trying. Another idea that I feel like has not gotten enough airplay is the concept of skunk works, right? This came out of Lockheed Martin, and you've seen a lot of the car companies do it. For those of you that are into automotive, AMG and STI. AMG is Mercedes-Benz's tuner, and they oftentimes get involved in the racing efforts and all of these. These are quasi-company people that are protected because they are a separate organization, but they're able to really practice innovation. The core of their being is innovation, right? And the skunk works at Lockheed Martin, they work on all kinds of crazy ideas. 90% of them are going to fail, but the 10% that do succeed completely validate all the resource and effort that the organization has put into it. But what you'll notice about all of these things is that they have a direct line to leadership. They are not beholden to the bureaucracy of the organization. They're completely skipping that and going straight up into leadership. That allows them to have flexibility. That allows them to move fast and break things. So consider that those kind of models when you think about in the future, when you're part of a large organization, how do we implement innovation well? Next one, sorry. We'll talk about startups really quickly. Startups are very agile because they have low overhead, right? They don't really have a lot of resources, but that also means they don't have a lot of costs. The key for them is move fast and break things. Like the idea is that you are going to fail several times. You just got to iterate your way to product market fit. And so MVP your way to PMF is something I've heard several times in the startup ecosystem. Minimum viable product, your way to product market fit, right? You just keep iterating, you keep changing something, you keep pivoting, you keep trying to find a way so that people are grabbing that idea out of your hands. It's very hard to do that. And, in our own business, we've been doing that several times. But we're trying to find a way to get something that people want, right? Sell something that people want. That's the key to business. At the core, I love this quote from Steve Blank, by the way, for those of you who want to go out into startup ecosystems. At the core, a startup is nothing more than a faith-based enterprise. It's almost a religious activity because all you have is a series of untested beliefs. So true. I've been in the startup ecosystem. I'll tell you, there's so many folks pursuing crazy ideas, but when it works, wow, the amount of value that they add to the world is just amazing. Startups fail as they scale due to a lack of risk infrastructure. Now, what Sarah asked earlier, it's clear that corporates also fail because they lack the risk infrastructure. But when you look at what happened with FTX and SBF, and oftentimes this is true for across multiple. You look at WeWork and the implosion of WeWork. A lot of that happened because there was no oversight. There was no risk and control infrastructure that could tell the founder no, right? You had SBF doing whatever he wanted to do in the background with client funds, and no one was there to really tell him no. There was no grown-up in the room to be able to say no to someone like that. And that's the founder paradox for all startups, right? You need the founder, you need his vision, you need his like passion, his religious fervor for the startup. But oftentimes that founder is the biggest risk to the business as they grow. It's great in the early days because you need that to fuel that first most difficult stage of startups. But once you get to scale, oftentimes they're a liability because of the passion that they have and their unwillingness to compromise to some of these ideas. But then again, you could say the same thing about Steve Jobs, right? It's very hard to find that line, which is why there's no clear sort of line in the sand that all the VCs can draw. There's no clear way to say this is how far a founder can go and no more, because when it works, they add so much value to the world that sometimes we do have implosions like FTX. There are ways to manage the risks. Let's talk about regulatory sandboxes, right? So back when I was in Singapore, the MAS established a regulatory sandbox for blockchain related concepts. So what they did was they said, we will ease the regulation to help these startups to try something new. We know that long-term, they can't just escape regulation, but in the short term, we'll set up a relaxed regulatory regime around this particular technology or this particular product set that allows them to experiment and learn from that. And for the regulator also to learn and see what works, what doesn't work when it comes to regulation. Similar thing happened here in the city of Chicago. If you remember the scooter trials that happened here, what did the city of Chicago do? They saw what was happening in many of these other cities and realized there is no way to stop the advance of these ride sharing or scooter sharing programs. What about if we do a 4-month test where we will allow the scooter share companies to come in and test on city roads, which means, like kind of relaxing the regulations around what can be parked on the sidewalk, for instance, what can be installed on a sidewalk, for instance. But that allowed them to learn from it and then ultimately bring up more common sense regulation that allows the scooter share companies to interact well with pedestrians and motorists and business owners. So regulatory sandboxes are a great way to encourage innovation in a controlled way. Another thing is establishing risk infrastructure, right? VCs who are on the board of these startups can start to mandate, and as power goes back from frothy days of the 2010s, you'll start to see VCs mandate more often some sort of risk infrastructure because they want to see that these investments can be protected, they can grow well and not be not the implosion of FTX. And so then I like to say innovation and risk management, how do they interact? Well, whether it's a corporate or a startup, innovation is hard. It's not simple. It's not like a weed that just grows randomly. It's something that takes intentionality. It's expensive. You need to have resources to be able to do it. But they are tied at the hip. Both of them require frameworks, and both of them require intentionality and people sort of like working together to produce a good outcome. I like to say, for those of you who want to take this philosophy into your life, risk management is a mindset, right? Once you're a risk manager, you're always a risk manager. You'll always be looking at the world from the context of what can go wrong, and that's not a bad thing. We never say that you have to avoid all risk. I hope everyone understands that. You cannot avoid risk in your life. Risk is good because it can lead to better outcomes. But what you want to do is not have that negative view of risk, but you need to apply the concepts of risk management, control your risk, right? Monitor your risk. Why do you have a fire extinguisher in your house? Because you're trying to control that risk. Why do you have a smoke detector in your house? You're trying to monitor that risk. So ultimately, once you get to that mindset, you'll apply it in every aspect of your life. You try to reduce risk in everything that you do. You try to make sure that you're able to control those outcomes to what you actually want. That's mostly my spiel here. I wanted to give some time for conversation because, again, I've spent a lot of time in banking, and it sounds like a lot of you guys want to get into finance and banking. If there's any questions I can answer from the risk management side, or some of the history of because I've been in this organization or in this field for a long time, I'd love to hear if you guys have any questions, even broader than risk management. If you want to talk about startups, that's great too. Anyone?
Tony, thank you very much. We have one question here, which is focusing on feedback loop. How we can continuously improve on our innovation and risk strategies. How do we make sure that, just that we are continuously, learning from our experimentation and improving our activities?
Yeah, and when you talk about setting up a framework for innovation, one of it is ensuring that there is a way to collect that feedback, right? For our business, for example, we've seen a lot of people just hand out a feedback form. What does that really mean? You need to be able to spend time, do customer discovery. So when you are putting a product out into the world, you have a certain customer in mind. That customer may not be the one that uses your product ultimately. They may not be the one that brings the most value to your product. Understanding once you put your baby out into the world, right? This is experimentation. You put the baby out into the world, you see who uses that, who interacts with that, and then you need to dig deeper and understand their motivations for why they're doing that. So that's what I meant by doing, establishing a framework and a feedback loop, because it's very easy for startups and corporates to throw out a self-validating feedback form, right? How well did you enjoy it? Great, wonderful. And it really doesn't give you any real insight into how are people using your product, what do they not like about your product, and how can you improve that product, right? You need to have a deeper connection. This is my personal experience. When I was doing customer discovery, one of the things post a release, one of the things that we found extremely valuable was sort of a free form kind of conversation. So we had a direct conversation with the customers. And then what we did was we opened it up and said, hey, tell us how you use this product. No other structure to that question. And the reason is we wanted to understand in that free form way, what did they do with it? How did they use it? And some of the best customer insights came from that kind of conversation. So it's important that you not only ask the right questions, but you also allow the customers to talk back to you. So that's what I meant by feedback loop. You need to have some way for people to do that. Does that make sense?
I think the person that who asked the question has a class at 6 o'clock, so he has. Yeah, there's another question that I think a lot of our students have. How do you develop a risk culture? Because if you think about it, in business schools, particularly in finance programs, we always talk about how you mitigate risk, how to get rid of risk. And viewing risk as an opportunity is something that we don't teach. We talk about it, and we don't have structure to say that, okay, if I'm going to take risk, how should I think about it? How should I approach it? What if I fail? There's always that concept. How do you create a risk culture within yourself and also within the organization?
Yeah, and some of that comes down to having hard conversations. I remember one time we were trying to establish risk tolerance for a payment system, and one of our stakeholders, a very senior stakeholder, was like, "Well, my risk tolerance is 0%. There is no tolerance for error at all," and we had to go back to that stakeholder, spend a lot of time sort of essentially telling him in a nice way, obviously senior stakeholders, you can't just say it plainly, but we were saying essentially, unless you have an unlimited amount of money, you cannot have a 0% tolerance for risk. It's just not possible. It's not physically possible. You need to be able to give us a realistic aim. So for example, if it's a certain time frame in which let's say it's around the settlement times, for example, he was saying there's a 0% tolerance for errors and failures. Okay, so we will ensure that there are no changes. The infrastructure is rock solid and no one has access during those periods to make any changes to ensure that we are meeting a higher threshold of risk within, lower threshold of risk within that particular window. You need to have conversations. There's no easy answer to how you build a risk culture. But one of the things also that's very important, so the Fed has something called a use test. So for those of you who go into operational risk, the Fed will not only ask risk practitioners. This is what they used to do before. They'd ask the risk practitioners, how is the risk, the concept of risk going? The head of operational risk say, great, everything's great. What they found was then they go to the head of vanilla securities, for example, right? They would go to the market's head and they'd say, explain to me how you manage operational risk. And they would have no clue. They couldn't actually articulate how they managed operational risk. So the Fed has a use test, which is they tell you that they're going to come in and talk to the frontline staff, not to us, the risk professionals, but to the frontline staff to see if they have an understanding and a knowledge of, or understand the taxonomy, the syntax of risk management. So when I go back to what you said about how do we create a risk culture, it's got to come from the top. They have to understand the value that risk management brings to them. And believe me, one of the things, for those of you who are going into operational risk, I'll tell you this. One of the ways we were able to do that is we told them, hey, if you are able to control your risk, if we're able to implement these procedures well, you can reduce the risk capital set aside. It improves your return, right? You can actually leverage this tied up capital for other reasons. It'll actually reduce your risk capital. So help us and work with us and help us to actually roll this out into the front line, show the frontline staff that you, the head of the business, are really bought in and really interested in this concept. So that's my answer. I think it has to come from the top. It has to be across the whole organization. It's not something that we as risk managers can do ourselves.
Okay. Another question is about global risk, geopolitical risk management. So while there are many tools to deal with financial risk or operational risk, how do we deal with geopolitical risk? Because obviously our control is so limited and its impact can be so tremendous.
Yes, absolutely. But there are known unknowns and there are unknown unknowns, right? There are known unknowns. We know that there is geopolitical risk, and particularly when you talk about volatile areas, we know that those risks exist. You can control for it by diversifying your supply chain, for instance, right? There are ways to control for it. And some of those controls are not just on the back of a single organization. It might be an industry action as well. And that we saw back when we were, when I was in the UK, the group came together, the group of banks came together because one of the rules in Basel II was punitive when it came to short-term debt, right? So short-term loans. Well, trade loans are a form of short-term loans, and they were being punished. And these banks were able to go back to the governing authorities and say, basically, if you do this, if you put these rules in place, you're going to inhibit trade. right? So there are regulatory and geopolitical risks where it's not going to be the action of a single organization, but entire industry together that recognizes, hey, there's a high level of geopolitical risk here. We as an industry need to respond to that by diversifying supply chains that might introduce a slightly higher cost in the short term, but in the long term, that means that we will be able to weather that particular storm. So there are things I think you can do as an organization. There are things that you need to do as an industry. Does that make sense?
All right, absolutely. Now, another question. Between risk management and innovation, what comes first? I know what your answer is going to be, but that's the question.
It's tough. It was a question that was asked at another startup panel that I was part of. And hopefully you guys can still see the presentation.
Something happened. Yeah.
Apologies. There we go.
Yeah, okay, we got it.
So one of the questions that was asked to me at a startup panel was, hey, do you always, like, as a startup in general, are you compliant with every regulation? Because, as a startup, sometimes you don't have the resources to comply with every regulation, okay? So what I'm trying to say is the principles of risk management can still be applied even when you're taking an elevated level of risk. So for instance, we had a company that was doing a certain kind of bottling, okay? And they weren't able to use the most compliant labels on that bottles. They knew the risk that they were going to take, which is that potentially they could get called out and the FDA would come in and slap them on the wrist and say, your label is not exactly to the standards that we've established, the size of the font and the layout of the specific label. However, they were able to say, okay, we're going to put a plain printed label on there for now that gives consumers the information. So they're not compliant with the letter of the law, but they are dealing with that particular risk that's in place, right? These are the kind of things where, yes, innovation, I think, is paramount because we need to be able to move forward as an organization, as a community, as a culture. We need to be able to move forward. Innovation is required there. But you can't ignore completely the risk management side. Even though you take risk, you should know what that risk is, you know what the outcomes are, and you should be able to control for that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm not trying to waffle out of the question. It's a tough question.
Yeah, these are top students, just they're asking a lot. Now, one thing that I had in mind, I wanted to ask you. So I get up in the morning and I see that, hey, this is a great idea. And what is the journey that I have to take to move that vision into actually selling my house and investing, just that every capital that I have in this new idea and going forward? What is the how do you sort of move that process forward?
Sure. And for those of you that haven't watched the Y Combinator videos, the Y Combinator, like the what's it called, the startup school, all of that, go watch it. I mean, as a business school student, you really should be aware of at least some of the principles of how to build a startup, because regardless of where, whether you go to a large corporate or you go to a startup, these principles are always valuable, right? Some of the things that they talk about, Y Combinator has a formula, man, it's very strict. First thing they say is talk to your customers. You are not going to build anything that is of value to this world without talking to your customers. You cannot be the customer of your product. You have to define who those customers are. You've got to get in front of them and you have to talk to them. So if you've got a great idea, that's wonderful, but you've got to validate that idea. First way you validate an idea is talk to your customer, see if that's a customer need that's actually there, right? That's part one. Once you've validated that customers actually care about this problem that you're trying to solve, right? The second part of that is going to be building an MVP. And when they say MVP, they mean minimum viable product. And this is something that I kind of messed up when I first started NakiNoku. But when you look through the examples of a true minimum viable product, there's been so many examples from Y Combinator companies of people building just a plain site. So they wanted to build this marketplace and they wanted to match, let's say it's a cleaning companies to customers or whatever. And so they have to build this whole system in between to be able to match them properly. Well, their MVP probably was some dude, the founder sitting in the back, like actually connecting companies with the customers. It's that man in the machine kind of concept, which is you don't actually build the whole thing. You build the basic thing that you need to be able to, like Google Forms, front end, and then a person actually, connecting these two people together, and emails from the founders. These are things that don't scale. And YC is famous for saying, do things that don't scale. It's counterintuitive. People would say, shouldn't you build an infrastructure that scales up? No, because if you do that, you're wasting a lot of the resources of the startup or the corporate into building all this infrastructure that you have no idea if people really want that. So it's very important that you do a true MVP, do the minimum that you can to actually show that people want this. And their true success stories are when people are literally grabbing it out of your hands and your wait list is completely blown up because people really want this product. That's when you know, sell the house, put all your money into it. This is going to be a success. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me.
Can
okay. Any other questions, ladies and gentlemen?
And actually, let me add one more, Evo, while people are thinking of questions, right? One more thing that, if any of these students, any of our students here start a startup, one of the things that we're always afraid of is somebody's going to steal our idea, right? I've been in the startup ecosystem now, probably like 6 years that we've done startups. Even with this one 3 years ago, I was really worried. Oh, if I put my baby out there, someone's going to steal this idea and do it too. Can I categorically tell you that in startups, execution is 90% of like what you've got? Your idea is only maybe like 10% or less of your actual value in this world. Execution is everything. So people who think I've got a great idea, I should do a startup, completely wrong. I'm a great execution guy. I'm able to bring a vision to life. Then you should be a startup founder. Why? Because everybody has an idea. Every time I bring this idea to someone tells me a variation of it that they had 10 years ago. Hey, what we should do is do this. But they never moved on it. They never acted on it. So if any of you have a great startup idea, don't be afraid to put it out there, right? When you build that Google form for that marketplace that's in your head, you're thinking, oh, somebody's going to find this and then they're going to build this out. They won't. There's so many examples of this. They won't, because execution is the most important part. So if you got an idea, don't be afraid to share it, in the sense of talking to people about it. Go out there and validate that idea and talk to VCs. Students, let me tell you something, it's been really eye-opening for me how much VCs are open to talking to students. If you reach out, I can almost guarantee you at least 2 or 3 of the VCs that you'll reach out to will reach back. It will be able to respond to you as well. They want students who are thirsty for knowledge, and they're more than willing to share their knowledge with you as well. So don't be afraid to reach out, man.
Okay. Perfect. Any other question? My chat box is open.
Mm-hmm.
Let me know if you have a question.
Go ahead. If anyone has any interest in how banking used to be done back in the days, back in the old days.
Well, why don't you tell us? Because at least I have a whole bunch of people are still listening.
So I'll tell you one interesting thing, one interesting fact about me. So a lot of you guys will see from my LinkedIn that I work for HSBC. The part that you don't know is that I was actually the 3rd generation at HSBC. My grandfather actually started working for what was then the British Bank of the Middle East. He left India in a boat, came over to Dubai, came down to Qatar, and he started working for the British Bank of the Middle East, which later became part of the HSBC family. And so I have been, I've had the privilege of seeing banking evolve over the years. And one of the things I will tell you is, organizations, if they're done right, leave a legacy behind that will truly impact the world. something like HSBC has had a hand in international trade from the inception, from its very beginning, founding in Hong Kong and Shanghai. That's what HSBC actually stands for, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. They have a true impact on the world. So whenever you end up in a company, I would encourage all of you to learn about the history of the company. You're part of a living, breathing organization, right? You're part of a living, breathing entity. And in the eyes of the law, it is an entity, it's a person, right? HSBC is a person under the eyes of the law. Understand what that history is and connect with it, because it gives meaning to work. We don't want to be people that go out there and work at a job just to make a paycheck and go home. You need to have purpose in what you do. You need to have meaning in what you do. So take time to understand the history. Talk to some of the old people. I was just posting one of these things where, when I was a young man in the early 2000s, I would walk by the desks of these folks who'd been at the bank for 30, 40 years. And they tell me these stories about how it used to be back when it was Marine Midland, and then it was bought by HSBC, and they still had some of the coins, and they would talk about how business was done back before, you guys were able to, do images and like electronic payments. It was checks, physical checks that were mailed around from bank to bank in large bags so that they could actually settle some of these transactions. How do banks get money? There's a cash service, that's what HSBC used to have, that physically flies large blocks of cash on pallets into central banks all over the world. Sometimes, we had lost cases that would come through that were, we left a bag of cash on the plane or whatever. It was, there's true value in understanding what banks and financial institutions bring to the world. Don't always absorb some of the negative connotations that people have about your particular industry. Spend time to understand the lore, the history, the all the stories. It's a powerful thing, and it gives meaning and value to the work that you do.
We just received another question for you.
Sure.
It says that I would like to know how I can expand risk management to my personal life, especially for someone who's interested in pursuing a career in finance.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about risk management, the principles of risk management are the principles of life. Like, how do you prevent bad things from happening? How do you understand the risk that you're taking, right? Every decision that you make when you walk out of your house is a potential risk. How do you minimize that or control it? I mean, it may not even be minimized. It's simply control. And I tell my wife this all the time. So, just a short story time here. I love motorcycles. I love to ride motorcycles. And most anyone will tell you that's not a risk management activity because you could die. You don't have a big metal cage surrounding you. So if you crash into something, you could die. I love motorcycles, but I am also a risk manager. So what do? I wear a full helmet, leathers. I try to protect myself as much as I can. That's called minimizing risk or controlling risk. You can never eliminate risk in your life, no matter what you do. You'll never eliminate risk. However, you can control it. You can understand what risks you're taking and try to control that risk within the context of whatever activity you're doing. You should never have to give up activities because the world considers it to be dangerous. What you should do instead is make sure that you have the appropriate controls in place. So if you think about the sub, right? I forget the name of it now, the one that went down into the Titanic and that imploded. There were clear indications that they were taking greater risk than they needed to, that they should have taken. There should have been a little bit, greater level of risk management in that space. Now, that was a business, but it was almost like it was his personal baby. It was his personal interest. Whatever you're doing in your life, you got to make sure that you have the appropriate level of control over that. Some of us will be doing home renovations. That wall there might be a structural wall. So if you decide to knock that out, you're weakening the structure of your house. You save $1,000 or you save $2,000, but you may be potentially weakening the structure of your house. I know the question was asked in the sense of how do I manage my personal finances, but I think of every activity that we do as a potential risk, something that we need to control for, not eliminate, but control for. On your personal finance side, obviously, you should be applying absolutely all of the risk management principles of diversification, right? Whether you're into real estate, don't put all of your money into real estate, because if that market turns bad, you're done for. Don't have all of your money concentrated in a single country. This is really interesting and really important for a lot of us who only buy American, US-based securities. You should absolutely diversify, make sure you have global holdings, because even an entire economy can have major issues, right? But if you diversify as much as you can globally, you have a much broader set that you can, that can be more resilient and survive, potential issues, regional issues. One of the things that happened for us when in one of the organizations I was part of was that there was a primary data center in city A, and that secondary data center was 12 miles away in city B. Well, we had a big snowstorm. Both the data centers went down, and no one was able to access their funds at that point because the whole system had gone down. Similarly, in our own lives, we need to think about, are we concentrating our risk too much in one single security location? Make sure that you're diversified properly. Does that make sense?
Okay. All right. Well, I think we have exhausted all the questions of students. I think everybody has to show a hand of appreciation to Tony for these wonderful comments. I think everybody is excited about it. So what we have done is that we have recorded you, Tony, and we will do some adjustment to the video to make it, just really professional looking, and then we'll make it available. And on behalf of our students, I want to thank you for sharing your life story, your professional story with us. I think it was really wonderful. I learned a lot, and I teach risk management. So, so thank you, and we'll touch base again.
Yeah, definitely. And if anyone wants to get a hold of me, look me up on LinkedIn. Always open to chat.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Have
you.
a great evening, and we shall talk again. Bye for now.